Hi, I'm Tania Melnyczuk. I'm from South Africa. I'll be 60 next year, and I got my autism diagnosis when I was about 42, 43. How did I realize that my sensory experience was different from the majority? I don't think that I consciously realized that until much later in life, but there were signs all the way along, starting with my birth. I was born in winter, and usually they put children into a warmer room then, the newborns. They did that with me, but I immediately developed a rash, so they moved me into a regular room. Step one. Number two, when I was a toddler, I got pertussis and I vomited a lot. I was really, really ill. And when I came out of that, my food, the things that I was prepared to eat, my sense of smell, everything had changed. Before that, my mother said I was really easy. I ate anything. And after that, I was just about every texture, every taste was off putting, and I got a really limited in my repertoire. For years after that, banana would make me feel ill if I just smelt it. And that's actually when I say years, some of those things went on for decades. With hindsight and with what I know now about how sensory hypersensitivity works, many people get, after they've been ill, they get hypersensitive to, like the smell of cleaning agents or just the smell of anything. The tastes are funny, they change because people lose electrolytes when they have a lot of diarrhea and when they vomit a lot. And that's just average people too. And I didn't know until about 10 years ago that in autistic people as well as in other people, sensory hypersensitivity pretty much relates to how many or how much you have of electrolytes in your body. And if that is dysregulated, if you have too little magnesium and too little potassium getting into your cells, you're going to be hypersensitive, which is also explains why I haven't had these hypersensitivities for the past 10 years, because I've known what to do to treat it. And okay, with some other people, it's going to be different things that are dysregulated, not necessarily exactly the same as mine, but always still related to potassium levels, whether they are sufficient, whether they're too much. So, but that persisted. So even after I was ill, even after I recovered, it was like I had, I don't know whether it was almost like a PTSD thing where you were scared of it once because it was awful then, and then it just remained awful, or whether I actually really remained that sensitive to smells and to tastes and to textures, but some of them were really revolting to me. Other signs where one could have seen that there was a big difference was that I was really sensitive to clothing labels. I was mohair, a jersey with mohair coming up to here would have been really awful and intolerable. So I had a very cute mohair jersey when I was a teenager, and I just couldn't wear the thing. But one of the reasons why I don't think it kind of stood out to me that in spite of these differences, that I was really that different was because I was accommodated. If I didn't want to eat certain things, my mother didn't force me to eat those things. My mother worked around my sensitivities. I had no autism diagnosis, and she did. I mean, it concerned her. She went to the doctor. The way that he said she should deal with my food sensitivities didn't work out, so she just went back to just giving me what I want and trying to give me vitamins once a week or something to make up for it. But there were signs that I was deficient in magnesium, which is a key component to being sensorially okay. I had constant constipation whenever I didn't have gastroenteritis, for example, as a child. I had leg cramps frequently as a child. Also a sign of magnesium deficiency, magnesium being important for getting potassium into your cells so that you won't be sensory hypersensitive. So those were two things that just kind of passed by, and one didn't see the connection back then. The other one was that I read a study once that, and it was a study done on 50 women who were mothers of autistic children. they discovered that 98% of them, in other words, 49 of them, were also had sensory weirdness, corresponding kind of to what their children experienced. So my mother is pretty sensitive to sound, not to the extent that I was at the height of my hyperacusis and my problems, but sensitive enough to go into a shop, there's loud music, and she will walk out and she's never going to buy there again. She startles easily when the supermarket packers, for example, and they're quite loud in my country because many of them are Xhosa, so it's normal to speak loudly when you're Xhosa. So they will shout something to the other person elsewhere down the corridor, and right next to her, and she startles like anything. She gets really, really angry with us. So when I was a child already, my father, who loved classical music, would play things like Mahler really loudly, and it would be annoying to both me and her. So I had a model of sensory sensitivity with me in my home, and therefore didn't necessarily see myself as being just that different from my mother. And I assumed that there would be other people like my mother who would also be bothered by things like that. So that didn't exactly stand out. I grew up in the disco era, and discos, well, actually, just nightclubs, even to this day, are really, really loud. But when I was young, there were people from that era who eventually went slightly deaf from this music because I seemed to experience it as even worse than they did. I frequently would go out if there was a dance on. Now, being a nerd, I didn't get that many opportunities to go out anyway. But when I did, I seemed to have a lower level of tolerance for those sounds than other people did. So, taste, smell, clothing labels, even vestibular things. I really didn't like many of the kind of rides you would have first in a children's play park, then later on in things like the amusement parks for adults. I didn't like being shaken about like that. Didn't like being tumbled at all. Um, but it wasn't until I was in my 40s, my early 40s, I think it was probably around about 14, that I started noticing that my car radio was hurting my ears even at a lower volume. And I mentioned this once to, I had some guys in the car who were neuro-different. One of them actually later did get his autism diagnosis. He was already identifying as autistic by then. And I just mentioned this pain, and he just said about how we get older and, our sensory issues change. I didn't even know at the time that these things were associated with autism, even though I knew this guy who was purportedly autistic. And I even identified one of my other colleagues as potentially autistic, but I didn't know that sensory issues were part of the thing. So it was a year after my autism diagnosis, when other people had been talking about their sensory issues, which I actually couldn't identify with, that I gradually started being able to label these things. I didn't even know what was causing some of my meltdowns, and I didn't know that they were sensorily triggered because I didn't know that such a thing exists. I had no vocabulary for this. I remember having a meltdown in my office because other people were talking when I was trying to concentrate. I remember the pain that I experienced when trying to listen to the type of music that my father liked once in a car trip. And I was alone in the car, and I was just in pain the whole time, and I thought, no, I've got to deny myself this and listen to this music, because I kind of wanted to relate to what my father liked in this music. So only probably 10 months or more after my autism diagnosis did anybody even tell me that sensory issues were part of autism, and start to describe things that I experienced in ways that I could understand. And then I realized that I was having these things more and more and badly, and I could become conscious of them and say, that's the thing that made me act out so extremely. Whereas before I would go like, why did I do that?